Welcome to our deep dive into the history of Apple. We're going way beyond the usual stuff with this one, pulling out some really fascinating bets from Histoire d'Apple, de Jobs au géant technologique actuel, and some interesting stuff I found on Wikipedia. Ready to see Apple's journey in a whole new light?
Absolutely. I think you'll be surprised by some of the twists and turns we uncover. Apple today seems like this unstoppable force, but their path to success was anything but straightforward.
Right. Like, we all know about the iconic products, but what about the stories behind them? The near misses, the bold decisions, the personalities that clashed. It's almost Shakespearean.
It really is. And it all starts in the 1970s, a time of social upheaval and technological ferment. Imagine those early days. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, two young guys driven by this counterculture spirit, wanting to make technology accessible to everyone, not just big corporations.
It's a far cry from the Apple we know today, with their high-end devices and global reach. So take us back to that garage workshop. What were those early days really like?
Well, their first creation, the Apple, I was essentially a bare circuit board, a far cry from the sleek devices we see today. They actually sold it for the rather curious price of $666.66. Apparently Wozniak just loved repeating digits and wasn't aware of any, shall we say, devilish connotations.
$666.66. That's pretty wild. And speaking of wild, can you believe how hard it was for them to get funding back then? Banks literally thought personal computers were a joke.
It's hard to imagine now, isn't it? The idea of everyone having a computer in their home seemed absurd to many. Thankfully, Jobs had this incredible persistence. He managed to convince Mike Markkula, an angel investor, to take a chance on them, and that investment was absolutely
It
crucial.
was a game changer, and it allowed them to develop the Apple II, a computer that truly embodied Wozniak's design philosophy.
Yeah.
Small, reliable, user-friendly, and most importantly, affordable.
Exactly. But it wasn't just about the technology itself. The design was a key factor, too. From the elegant case by Jerry Manick to the innovative power supply designed by Rod Holt, they understood that aesthetics mattered.
This really highlights how Apple, even in those early days, was already thinking differently. It wasn't just about function. It was about creating a complete experience.
Absolutely. They were pioneers in understanding the emotional connection people could have with technology. But it wasn't always smooth sailing. Take the Apple III, for example. It was supposed to be their big push into the business market, but it ended up being a costly flop.
Oh yeah, the Apple III. What went wrong there?
Well, it's a classic case of committee-driven design. Too many cooks in the kitchen, even with Jobs at the helm. It highlights a challenge that Apple would face time and again, balancing creative vision with the realities of bringing a product to market.
And it seems like those internal tensions really came to a head with the arrival of the IBM PC in the early 80s, right? Microsoft, led by Bill Gates, immediately saw the threat, but Apple took a whole year to grasp the significance. Can you imagine that happening today?
It's remarkable, isn't it? Perhaps their early success with the Apple IIs, which continued to thrive in homes and schools, made them a bit overconfident. But around this same time, there's this almost mythical visit that Apple engineers make to Xerox PARC, where they get a glimpse of the future. Graphical interfaces.
Ah, the Xerox PRC visit. That's one for the history books. There's still debate about whether they simply licensed the ideas or borrowed a bit more liberally. What's your take?
Well, it's a bit of a gray area, isn't it? Inspiration versus imitation, the line can be blurry. Regardless, what's important is that this visit sparked a revolution at Apple. It led to the Lisa, a revolutionary but expensive flop, which in turn paved the way for the Macintosh.
And we can't talk about the Macintosh without mentioning the iconic 1984 Super Bowl ad, right? Directed by Ridley Scott, no less. Did you know that ad almost didn't air? The board of directors hated it. Luckily, they were overruled.
It's amazing to think how close we came to never seeing that ad. It's become a cultural touchstone. But there's still debate about whether it actually sold Macs. Some argue it was more art than effective marketing. But one thing's for sure. It cemented Apple's image as a rebellious force, challenging the status quo.
That image, that rebelliousness, was very much tied to Steve Jobs, wasn't it? But behind the scenes, a power struggle was brewing. Jobs versus Scully. Clashing visions for the future of Apple. And it ultimately led to, well, let's save that for part two.
Let's. But I think it's safe to say that Apple's story is full of these dramatic turns, driven by larger-than-life personalities and a relentless pursuit of innovation. So as we left off, Apple in the mid-'80s was facing some major internal turmoil. It's hard to imagine Apple without Jobs, but that's exactly what happened.
Right. Both Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak ended up leaving the company they founded. What led to that?
It was a culmination of factors. Wozniak felt Apple had lost its way, straying from its original mission of empowering individuals. He was disillusioned with the increasingly corporate direction. And Jobs, well, his visionary but often abrasive style led to clashes with CEO John Sculley.
So Apple is now without its two Steves, the masterminds behind its success. The 1990s must have been a pretty turbulent time.
They were. Apple really struggled to find its footing. They released a dizzying array of Mac models, which confused customers and diluted their brand. And there were some costly missteps, like the Newton. Remember that? Their early attempt at a personal digital assistant, or PDA for short.
Vaguely. It wasn't exactly a hit, right?
It was ahead of its time in some ways, but it was clunky expensive, and the handwriting recognition was notoriously bad. A classic example of Apple reaching for the future, but not quite getting there.
Then there was that whole AIM alliance. Apple, IBM, and Motorola teaming up. What was the thinking there?
It was a bold move born out of necessity. They were trying to create a new computing platform to challenge the dominance of Microsoft and Intel. Think of it like a tech world Avengers team, each bringing their own strengths. The PowerPC chip, for instance, was a result of that collaboration. It was a powerful processor designed to compete with Intel's offerings.
But it didn't quite work out as planned, did it?
No, it didn't. The alliance ultimately fractured due to internal conflicts and shifting market dynamics. The PowerPC chip had some success, but it never really achieved widespread adoption.
And things got really dire for Apple in the late 90s. There were even rumors that they might go bankrupt.
They were perilously close. In fact, they were almost acquired by Sun Microsystems. Can you imagine that? Apple being swallowed up by another company? That's how close they were to disappearing.
It's mind-blowing to think about, especially considering where they are today. But then comes this almost unbelievable turn of events. Steve Jobs returns to Apple. Talk about a comeback story.
It's one of the most dramatic chapters in business history. Remember NXT, the company Jobs founded after leaving Apple. Well, Apple ended up acquiring NXT, bringing Jobs back into the fold.
And ironically, the software Jobs developed at NXT, Next Big Step, became the foundation for Mac OS X, the operating system that still powers Macs today.
Talk about a twist of fate. The company Jobs built after leaving Apple ends up saving Apple. And that acquisition marked the beginning of what we call the iRevolution, the era of the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad.
You know, we often focus on the products themselves, but what's fascinating to me is how Apple, under Jobs' leadership, completely redefined the consumer electronics industry.
Absolutely. It was a combination of design brilliance, marketing savvy, and this uncanny ability to anticipate what consumers wanted before they even knew it themselves. Let's take a closer look at this revolution, starting with the iMac in 1998.
Okay, so imagine it's 1998, the internet's taking off, but computers are still these beige boxes, intimidating to most people. And then comes the iMac. Translucent plastic, bold colors, all in one design. It was a radical departure.
It was a statement. It said, this isn't your father's computer. It was fun, it was approachable, it was cool, and it was a smash hit. Sales exploded, and suddenly Apple was back in the game.
But the iMac was just the beginning. Then came the iPod in 2001. It wasn't just a better MP3 player, it was a cultural phenomenon. Do you remember the first time you saw someone wearing those white earbuds?
It was a signal. It said, I'm part of something new. The iPod wasn't just about listening to music. It was about belonging, about style. And it completely transformed Apple's finances, giving them the resources to invest in even more ambitious projects.
And that leads us to 2007, the year the world changed, the iPhone.
The iPhone wasn't just a smartphone, it was a paradigm shift. It converged so many existing technologies, the touchscreen, the internet, music, apps, into one intuitive, beautifully designed device. It was a revolution.
It really was. And then, just to solidify their dominance, they released the iPad in 2010. Tablets went from being this niche product to a mainstream must-have. With this string of hits, Apple achieved the unthinkable. They surpassed Microsoft in market value, becoming the most valuable company in the world.
It was a symbolic victory after years of struggle. It showed just how far they had come. But as we know, no success story is without its challenges.
And those challenges became increasingly complex in the years that followed. It's interesting how Apple's story is so intertwined with Steve Jobs, but even after his passing in 2011, they continued to innovate and push boundaries.
Right. Tim Cook took the helm and navigated Apple through a period of immense growth and change. Think about the Apple Watch, for instance. That was a whole new product category for them.
Right.
A foray into wearable technology.
You've probably seen people wearing Apple Watches, right? It was a bold move, but it hasn't quite reached the same level of dominance as the iPhone or the iPad.
Exactly. And it raises some interesting questions. Can Apple continue to define new categories with the same level of success? Or are they becoming more reliant on iterating on existing products?
And speaking of iterations, they've made some pretty significant changes under the hood with their Macs in recent years. Remember when they transitioned from PowerPC chips to Intel? Well, they did it again, switching to their own custom-designed Apple Silicon chips.
That was a huge gamble, but it's paying off. Apple Silicon has enabled them to create incredibly powerful and energy-efficient Macs. It's giving them even more control over their hardware and software ecosystem.
It's fascinating to see how Apple is constantly pushing the boundaries of what's possible. But they're also facing increasing scrutiny. There have been concerns about labor practices in their supply chain, questions about their impact on the environment, and growing concerns about the power and influence of big tech in general.
It's a sign of the times. As technology becomes more deeply integrated into our lives, we're starting to ask harder questions about the companies that create it. Apple, with its immense size and influence, is inevitably going to be at the center of those conversations.
So where does all of this leave Apple as we look to the future? What will their next chapter look like?
Well, if their past is any indication, it's going to be full of surprises. They're investing heavily in artificial intelligence. With Siri becoming more and more integrated into their products, there are rumors of them developing augmented reality glasses, and they're facing growing competition from companies like Samsung, Google, and even up-and-coming Chinese brands.
It's hard to imagine what the tech landscape will look like in 5, 10, 20 years. But one thing's for sure, Apple will continue to play a major role in shaping it.
Absolutely. And their journey from that garage workshop to global tech giant is a testament to the power of innovation resilience and a relentless pursuit of excellence.
Wow, what a journey it's been. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the humble beginnings to the iRevolution and beyond. It's been amazing to revisit these iconic moments and uncover some lesser-known stories along the way.
It's been my pleasure, and I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that Apple's story is far from over. It will be fascinating to see what they do next.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we'll leave you with this. Apple has always defied expectations. They've faced challenges, stumbled, and risen again stronger than ever. Can they continue to do so in a world that's changing faster than ever? What do you think Apple's next big move will be?
That's the question, isn't it? Only time will tell. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep exploring.